"You set foot on that lake one more time and I'll have your family kicked out of here," Karen's voice hissed right at my front door. But the day she bragged about the great fishing season, I stepped up and planted a bright red sign, "Fishing closed," by order of the owner. It wasn't just revenge, it was a lesson. Never think fake authority can silence. If it were you, would you dare take down an arrogant HOA? Which state are you in, and has your HOA ever crossed the line with you? I pulled our familiar wooden boat toward the lake's edge, my son trotting behind me, eyes lighting up at the sight of the shimmering morning water. He was eager for a short paddling trip, treating it as a rare joy after long, heavy school days. I bent down to retie the anchor rope, simply wishing for a peaceful moment. But before I could even lower the oar into the water, the air shifted. A group of people approached, their steps synchronized like a deliberate show of force. They all wore light-colored suits, strutting as if the lake belonged to them. Leading the group was the HOA president, her face sharply made up, smile laced with both contempt and challenge. She stopped at the bow of my boat, finger raised straight, pointing at me like a defendant on trial. "People like you aren't allowed to dock here. The rules have changed." Her voice was shrill but cutting, echoing across the dock loud enough for a few neighbors to turn and look. I froze, hand still gripping the anchor rope. I tried to stay calm, answering slowly so I wouldn't scare my son. "I haven't received any notice about a rule change. This dock is for residents. We just want a quiet morning." But she didn't let me finish. The hand holding a sheet of paper swung up as if to slice through the air, her cold eyes sweeping past me and landing squarely on my son. That look was full of disdain, as if the boy had no right to set foot near this lake. "Read it carefully!" She spat each word, voiced disgust. "You should ask yourself whether you even belong in this community." What I heard in that sentence wasn't about rule, it was exclusion. It wasn't about what I was doing, but who I was, and who my family was. The dock fell silent for a beat, then a few thin chuckles broke out from behind. A man stood with arms crossed, lips curled in a smug smirk, as if he had waited for this moment just to feel superior. My son stood frozen, tiny fists clenched tight, eyes on me, silently begging for reassurance. I could feel him trembling, and in that instant, every bit of calm in me shattered. I wanted to speak, to crush that smug expression, but my throat locked up. All I could do was grip my hands tightly, fighting to keep from saying anything that might scare my son more. The stares around us felt like needles in my back. Some were curious, some cold, and some came with cruel little snickers. No one stepped in. No one stopped the abuse of power. They just watched, as if I were receiving a public sentence, and they were there to enjoy the show. She looked at me for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, her steps slow and deliberate, as if each one was meant to stamp down her disdain. The people behind her nodded in agreement. Someone whispered something, and burst out laughing, just loud enough for me to hear the ridicule. I bent down, reaching to lift my son into the boat, but his hand was trembling. "Dad, what did they say?" His voice quivered. I didn't answer right away. I just ruffled his hair, trying to hide the fire in my chest. I knew if I said even a word at that moment, fury in me would explode and give them exactly the excuse they were waiting for. I took a deep breath and looked straight out at the still lake. The water remained clear and blue. The sunlight still shimmered brightly, but the peace had vanished. In its place was a cold heaviness spreading through my chest. This was supposed to be where my son and I found a bit of calm, a place where good family memories could resurface after hard days. And yet, in just a few minutes, with a handful of cold words, the HOA president had turned it into a place of humiliation. I gripped my son's hand tightly and led him away. I didn't want him to witness another laugh or another stare. In my mind, a thought sparked. I would not forget this day, the day I was disgraced, and one day she would feel what I felt. The road ahead would be long, full of more insults, more blatant threats. But right now, one thing was clear to me. I would not let myself or my son be crushed by that false sense of power. The paddle had not yet touched the lake, but deep inside, a wave had already begun to rise. It wasn't loud, not yet violent, but I knew it would swell, and it would wipe out every person who believed they had the right to decide another's worth. That was the moment I understood. The battle between me and the HOA truly begun. The community meeting was held in a small hall next to the park. The ceiling was low, and bright white lights shone down on rows of straight wooden chairs. The air was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and old paperwork. I walked in with a few other residents, trying to keep a calm appearance, though inside I hadn't stopped boiling since the confrontation at the dock. My son stayed home doing homework. He begged to come, but I didn't want him to face any more contempt. I took a seat in the middle row and immediately felt eyes turn toward me. Some faces were indifferent, others offered stiff nods. pods. I heard the faint whisper, just enough to know the only topic they were discussing was my family. While I tried to steady myself, Karen stepped to the podium. She appeared with smug confidence, her light-colored suit making her stand out in the otherwise dull room. Holding a thick folder, she banged it down on the podium, as if to demand attention, though everyone had already locked eyes on her the moment she walked in. With a mocking smile, she scanned the room and stopped at me, her sharp gaze slicing through the air. "We've got a new resident who thinks this lake is his backyard," she said, dragging each word. Final sounds were harsh, deliberate, meant to dig in deep. The entire room erupted in laughter. Whistles and mocking claps rang out from a few corners. I sat still, hands clenched tightly, my throat closed, and it felt like I'd just been torn from the role of a regular resident and put on display as their entertainment. I looked around and saw the eyes of neighbors I used to greet during morning walk. Now they sat there laughing along, as if their joy was built on my humiliation. Some tapped their chairs, others shook their heads with feigned pity while still smiling, all blending into the heavy air of public shaming. An older man in the front row muttered, "All he really wanted was to take his kid out on the boat." The words had barely left his mouth before Karen's icy glare snapped to him. She didn't need to speak. One look was enough to make him drop his gaze and fall completely silent. In that moment, I understood. Power here wasn't in the rules, it was in fear. Karen went on, preaching about preserving community value, about resident standard, about how some people don't understand that this lake is a symbol of luxury. But to me, every word was just a thin layer covering up arrogance and prejudice. Each sentence landed like a blade, stabbing at my dignity, reminding me that in her eyes, my son and I would never belong. I sat there, didn't argue, didn't react. What burned in me wasn't just her words, it was how she pulled the whole crowd into this ritual of humiliation. I felt like a target, a live example meant to warn anyone who dared question or deviate. I caught the eyes of a few people who weren't laughing, but they didn't dare speak either. They looked at me with a hint of sympathy, then quickly lowered their heads, pretending to study the program sheet. I knew that among them, many had likely tasted the same kind of oppression. Fear had locked them in place. Karen's words kept rolling like a public sentence being read aloud. The crowd continued to play along, creating a painful contrast. One person on stage laughing smugly, one sitting below choking on silence, and the rest clapping like an audience enjoying a cheap performance. I closed my eyes brief, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't react then, because any word I said in that moment would be twisted and turned into ammunition for her to strike again. But I also knew this silence wouldn't last forever. When Karen ended her speech with the vague line, "If anyone's unhappy, the gate is always open," the room burst once again into applause. I looked up and stared straight at her. In that moment, I didn't see a community leader. I saw someone who thrived on power, who lived on suppression and disdain. She left the podium with a proud stride, her eyes glancing at me one more time, as if to remind me the game had only just begun. I didn't respond, only held my gaze steady and buried everything boiling inside. I walked out of the hall. No one called after me. No one reached out to comfort me. Only the sound of laughter mixed with closing doors remained. But in that silence, one thing was clear. I had been turned into a public joke, and she had gotten exactly what she wanted. Still, that public humiliation didn't break me. On the contrary, it carved my resolve even deeper. Karen might savor the crowd's laughter today, but I knew there would come a time when that laughter would come back and strike her in the face. And when that day comes, I won't just reclaim the right to use the boat on the lake. I'll reclaim the justice she stole from me in that very meeting. Just 1 week after the humiliating meeting, everything in my and my son's daily life suddenly felt heavy, as if draped under an invisible net. Early in the morning, before I could take a sip of coffee, I found the first citation plastered on my front door. The reason sounded like a joke: boating in an unauthorized area. I looked back at the dock, remembering clearly that I hadn't even gone on the lake that day, yet the paper sat there, black ink printed bold like an unchallengeable verdict. I crushed it in my hand and threw it in the trash. But the next morning, another notice appeared. This time it claimed, "Fence color not compliant, community standard." I stood frozen in front of the white wooden fence that had been there since the day we moved in. It looked no different from dozens of other homes around me, but in Karen's eyes, it had somehow become evidence to act upon. I began to realize this was no coincidence. It was a calculated seed. Day by day, the notices kept coming. More warnings, more violations. My car, parked near the curb, was photographed and attached to a fine. The lawn was accused of being uneven in color. One day, I even saw a group of people in light-colored suits walking in a straight line, stopping to take pictures in front of my house as if I were a criminal. Every paper was another blade, and I knew whose hand was behind them. No one, Karen. One afternoon, just as I returned home with my son, I saw her standing right at our door. The sunlight slanted across her figure, casting a long shadow on the pavement, felt like a cold wall rising in front of us. My son gripped my hand tightly, fear flickering in his eye. I started to walk past, but her voice through the air, sharp, harsh, commanding. If you set foot on that lake one more time, I'll make sure your family can't survive here. Each word sliced past my ear like a blade. It wasn't just a threat to my right to the lake. It struck at our life, our dignity. I stood still, staring into her eyes. In them, I didn't see a community leader. I saw someone drunk on power, feeding off others' fear. Pressed my lips together, forcing myself to stay calm. I knew if I said even a single word, she would twist it into another excuse to tighten the grip. My son suddenly burst into tears, his sobs echoing across the quiet yard. He looked up at me and choked out, "Dad, why do they hate us?" My heart clenched. He was too young to understand the schemes behind it all, to know that sometimes people hate others for no justifiable reason, just to assert their power. I knelt and held him close, whispering, "It'll be over, son, I promise." But when my eyes flipped back to Karen, I saw her smiling faintly, as if savoring my helplessness. She turned and walked away, her steps slow, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I brought my son inside and shut the door firmly. Inside me, anger rose like a storm held back for too long. I had stayed silent. I had been patient, but now there was no room left for restraint. Every citation, every cruel remark, every contemptuous glance had built into a fire that burned hot and unforgiving. I walked into the study and pulled out the folder from when I bought the house. My hands trembled slightly, but my eyes were lit with resolve. I remembered the older man's hesitant defense during the last meeting, how he fell silent the moment Karen glared at him. Maybe he had been through this too, and I knew that if I didn't stand up now, others would eventually become the next target. I opened the documents one by one, reading the legal language carefully. Karen believed her arrogance people quiet, but she was wrong, because in this very moment, I swore I would never let someone like her win. I didn't just want to protect my son. I wanted to put an end to the arrogance that had turned this neighborhood into a stage for public humiliation. I knew that once I committed to this, nothing would be the same again. My son had fallen asleep on the sofa after crying. I sat beside him, looking at his tear-streaked face. In my heart, the determination was set in stone. I could not let him grow up believing that people had the right to crush others' worth just because they held a title or power. That night, I opened my computer and started digging into everything about the HOA, their real authority, and the history of the lake. Lines of text filled the screen, rushed notes scribbled beside me, all becoming the first step in a battle I knew would be hard fought. Karen had crossed the line. She had turned a silent father into someone determined to give it all back. And I knew, from this moment on, the path fight back had begun. If you were pushed this far in your own neighborhood, how would you respond? Leave a comment. That night, after my son had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the study. The wooden desk was covered in piles of scattered documents from when we moved in, most of which I had ignored, trusting that the home purchase paperwork held nothing unusual. Karen's threats still echoed in my head, along with my son's stifled sob. I understood that if I wanted to break free from her grip, I had to find a weak point. I began opening every folder: property certificates, community regulations, and HOA bulletins. My eyes scanned, but the more I read, the more I realized how much I had overlooked. When I bought the house, I had only cared about square footage, location, and price, barely glancing at the community regulation. Tonight, I read every sentence, every line, and then suddenly stopped at a small footnote. It clearly stated that the Central Lake was not HOA-owned property, but was only managed under a lease agreement with a real estate development company. I froze, carefully rereading it to be certain. Those dense lines of text lit up like a beacon in the dark. HOA did not own the lake, and their authority was limited. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. The things Karen constantly boasted about, that the lake was an untouchable symbol of the community, that she was solely responsible for every decision about it, might have all been inflated claims to preserve control. If this were true, then every restriction placed on me had been part of a power play, not grounded in law. The next day I spoke with Mr. Bennett, a neighbor in his 70s. He often walked slowly around the neighborhood and rarely attended meetings. I had always thought of him as a quiet old man, but that day, when I mentioned the citations, something familiar sparked in his eyes. I tested the waters, asking if he had ever noticed the clause about the lake. He stopped walking, glanced around as if afraid someone might hear, then leaned in and whispered, "If you know the rules, you can flip the whole game." The sentence was short but heavy. He said nothing more, just patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving behind a sense of curiosity and the feeling that he had just handed me a key. I decided to return to the documents, this time not just to read but to dig. Over the following days, I quietly conducted research. I searched online for details about the development company that had built the neighborhood. It turned out to be a corporation with several projects across the city, but in recent years, it had faced financial trouble. Older news articles showed they had liquidated multiple properties. As I connected the dot, I realized something. The lease agreement that gave the HOA authority over the lake was set to expire in less than 1 year. If I was right, then all I needed was to wait for the right moment. The HOA's control over the lake would vanish. All of Karen's threats, all the baseless fines would lose their bite. I could step in, purchase or obtain legal rights, and turn that lake into a space no one could ever forbid again. I closed my eyes and pictured Karen standing before the crowd, still arrogantly boasting about her power, while I stepped forward with undeniable evidence, tearing down the entire illusion she had built. The thought sent heat rushing through my body. This was no longer about the boat. It was a battle for dignity. I began collecting every piece of related documentation, the old lease agreement, addenda, and notes on expiration date. I even contacted the county land records office and obtained certified copies to verify. Every detail aligned with my suspicion. The HOA was only borrowing authority to intimidate, while in reality, they held no lasting control. One night, I sat at my desk, laying out all the documents, staring at the expiration date. Only a few months left. I exhaled, then smiled. For the first time in weeks, my heart pounded with excitement, not anger. In my hands, I finally held the key to flipping the entire game. I stepped to the window and looked out at the moonlit lake. The water was still, a gentle breeze drifting across, but I no longer saw it as a place controlled by people in light-colored suits. I saw it as an open door, an opportunity waiting to be seized. I told myself that soon, this lake would no longer be a tool for Karen's oppression, but a place where my son and I could hold our heads high, and I would make it mine, not through arrogance, through the rightful authority I had uncovered. The surge of determination rose in me, and I knew the real battle was just beginning. Karen might think she held the upper hand, but every page I held was a warning bell. When the time came, the tide would turn. I closed the folder, but inside, I was burning with conviction. The one who thought she controlled everything was about to face a takedown she never saw coming, and I would be the one to light the fuse. That afternoon, the community hall was packed. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. People sat shoulder to shoulder, all appearing curious about the emergency meeting Karen had titled Restoring Order. The air was thick with anticipation and intrigue. I walked in and quietly took a seat near the center of the room. Eyes turned toward me almost immediately. There were a few stiff nods, a few probing looks, and even some mocking smile. I understood at once that I was the centerpiece Karen planned to showcase today. The hall doors closed and Karen entered as if stepping onto a stage. Fitted light-colored suit, hair neatly tied and high heels echoed sharply against the tile floor. She stepped to the podium with confidence, eyes sweeping across the rows of seats as if to assert complete control. Once she was sure everyone had fallen silent, she gave a slight smirk and began in a firm tone. Today we are not here to discuss petty matters, but to protect the values of a sophisticated, proud community. Some people don't understand that. If they don't like it, the gate is always open for them to leave. Final word of her sentence fell like a hammer striking the room. Applause erupted across the hall, with several people nodding in agreement. Someone even whistled. The scattered laughter made me feel as if I had been dragged onto a public scaffold. Every eye was on me. No one needed to name names. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. I sat still, my hands tightly clasped together. A choking feeling crept up my throat, but I refused to let myself react. I stared straight at the podium, seeing the triumph in Karen's eyes. She made no effort to hide it. In fact, she was relishing this moment as though it were a well-rehearsed performance. A middle-aged man sitting in the row ahead turned and looked at me with sympathy, but when he caught Karen's cold glance, he immediately bowed his head. Many others did the same. They saw the injustice, but none dared to speak. Their silence was complicity. Karen knew it. She leaned on that silence to turn her words into truth. I remembered every burst of laughter. It wasn't the laughter of joy. It was laughter inflated by fear. The laughter of people going along just to protect themselves. To them, I had become a necessary example. Proof that anyone who challenged the HOA's will would be humiliated in front of the entire community. Karen stepped down from the podium and strolled down the center aisle, speaking as if delivering a guided lecture. This is a community of refinement, of value, of standard. Cannot allow a few careless actions to ruin the beautiful image we have built over so many years. Each word struck like a blow to my chest. She didn't need to say my name. Everyone knew who the few careless actions referred to. to. I could hear whispers behind me. It's him. The new family that just moved in. That single murmur was enough to make me feel trapped in a suffocating room with no way out. I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to react. I knew that any word I said now would become Karen's excuse to cut in and twist the humiliation deeper. She wanted to see me crack, to watch me lash out so she could disgrace me in front of everyone. I decided I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. When Karen ended her performance with a mocking smile and the closing line, "If anyone's unhappy, they know what to do," the crowd clapped again. The applause was loud, cold, merging with the sound of her heels striking the floor as she walked out of the hall. I stayed seated, my eyes fixed on her back. Inside me, fire of fury blazed, but with it came clarity. I knew Karen thought I had been broken, but she had no idea that in my mind, the pieces of a plan for retaliation were already falling into place. I couldn't show it yet, but I was certain that very soon she would pay for every word of ridicule she delivered today. As the hall gradually emptied, I stood up and left. No one spoke to me. No one dared come close, but I didn't feel isolated. Instead, I felt the strength of conviction pulsing in my chest. Karen might control the crowd through fear, but I now held a critical clue about the lake lead, and that would be the double-edged blade to turn everything around. I walked out the door without looking back. The day was fading, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows on the street. I knew this moment would haunt me for a long time, but it would also drive me forward. The plan for retaliation had formed clearly in my mind. I would not only protect my son and my dignity, I would make Karen bow before the very people she once looked down on. And when that day came, there would be no laughter left to mock me, only the silence of the defeated. I gathered everyone at Mr. Bennett's small house, former lawyer I had trusted with the secret about the lake. That night, the cramped living room glowed under a warm yellow light, the smell of tea drifting through the air. Each person stepped in cautious, eyes uncertain, as if even the walls might be listening. I looked around and saw clearly within them two things: fear and resentment. First to speak was an elderly woman, her hand trembling as she held a cup of tea. She said that a year ago, she was fined for planting an extra rose bush in front of her porch. Karen had brought a group with her, forced the woman to sign a removal notice, and threatened to revoke her access to the pool. She refused. In all her life, the woman said, she had never been humiliated like, and all because of a few small flowers. I looked at her aged, wrinkled face, her eyes brimming with tears, and I understood. The pain wasn't just about the flower, it was about her dignity being trampled. A dark-skinned, middle-aged spoke next in a whisper. His family had been publicly named in the HOA newsletter for throwing a birthday party with music that was too loud. Karen had stood in front of dozens of residents and singled him out, calling it an example of cultural disrespect. His voice caught in his throat and he stared at the floor, the memory clearly still deeply carved inside him. Then came a widowed woman, thin and fragile, her hands clasped tightly together. When she spoke, her voice shook. She said I wasn't wealthy enough to live here. The words cut through the already tense room like a blade. Silence followed. No one needed to elaborate. The contempt in that statement was undeniable. The woman burst into tears. They streamed down her cheek, her body trembling as if she had held it in for far too long. I felt something rise in my chest, grief and fury. I sat and listened to every story, every exposed wound. They all shared one thing in common. Each had been publicly shamed by Karen, used as an example to threaten the rest of the community. She had wielded the HOA's authority to feed fear, to keep people submissive. And now, after being turned into her next target, finally understood just how cruel her tactics were. I looked around the room, at red eyes, lowered head, shaking hands. I knew the silence had to be broken. I stood, pushed my chair back so it scraped loudly against the floor. All eyes turned to me. "We've had enough," my voice echoed in the small room. "Karen thinks she can control us with citations, with contemptuous glares, with public humiliation. But she's wrong. She may have stolen joy from each of us. She forgot one thing. When you push people too far, eventually, they rise." I paused, locking eyes with each person. When she threatened my boat, she crossed a line. That boat wasn't just a boat. It was the right to live with fairness, the right to be treated as human. And I swear, I'll show her what happens when you disrespect others. The room fell completely silent. The ticking of the wall clock echoed loud and clear. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on me, as if waiting for something more. I took a deep breath and ended with, "This is no longer just about me. This is a fight for all of us." For a brief moment, the room stayed absolutely still. Then, like a wave spreading outward, nods began to appear. Mr. Bennett gripped my hand tightly, his face set and firm. The man who had been shamed for playing music pressed his lips together, a spark of determination flashing in his eye. The elderly woman forced to uproot her roses nodded gently, her hands trembling, but her gaze more resolute than ever. The widowed woman wiped away her tears and nodded too, though her lips still quivered. In that moment, I felt a strange kind of energy. Fear was still there, but it had been replaced by a shared resolve. They no longer looked at each other as isolated individuals, but as people in the same boat, and I knew that with them beside me, Karen would no longer move unchecked. I sat back down, my voice softer now. We need to be careful. Karen won't sit still. She may have ears everywhere, but we have something she will never have: truth and unity. The group fell quiet, then nodded all at once. I saw a shift in their eyes. What had once been resignation now carried the glint of hope. They believed in me, but more importantly, they believed in themselves. That night, as I left Mr. Bennett's house, I walked under a pale moonlight. The wind brushed over the lake, gentle ripples dancing across the surface, and I felt my heart pounding. I knew the fight ahead would be brutal. Karen would try everything to bring me down, but I also knew this: I was no longer alone. I remembered my son's tears, his innocent question, "Dad, why do they hate us?" Now, I could answer him. Not everyone does. There are people like you who have endured, and together we will rise. I clenched my fist, feeling the fire in my chest burn bright. Karen had gone too far, and now it was my turn. I would not only protect my family, but also those she had trampled. And when that day came, she would face not just me, but the voices she tried for so long to silence. If you were in my shoes, how would you strike back so the HOA pays the price? Leave a comment below. After the private meeting with the residents who had been oppressed by Karen, I returned home tense but clearer than ever. A retaliation plan couldn't stop at declaration. It needed a concrete move, a real strike to flip the board. I recalled the detail in the home purchase contract, that faint clause confirming the lake wasn't owned by the HOA but merely leased. That night, I sat for hours in front of my computer, tracing every lead tied to the real estate company holding the lake's deed. The name Meridian Development kept surfacing, a corporation once thriving, now struggling under mounting debt. I found the number to their main office. The next morning, after dropping my son off at school, I returned to my desk, took a deep breath, and made the call. A woman answered, professional but tired. I introduced myself, explaining I was a resident of Lakeside and interested in discussing the lake. There was a pause. Then she said she'd transfer me to legal. Less than a minute later, flat, gruff voice came on. He introduced himself as Branson, in charge of liquidating the company's assets. I kept it short. I'd like to purchase the rights to manage fishing season at the lake inside Lakeside Estate. There was silence, then a dry laugh. You're a resident? This isn't a joke. The HOA currently manages that under a lease. I answered firmly, I know that lease is about to expire, and I know your company needs to recover capital. I'm prepared to make a serious offer. There was a beat of hesitation. Then he asked me to send a formal letter. I wrote it that same day and emailed it over, offering a substantial sum in exchange for exclusive authority over fishing season decisions for the next 10 years. It wasn't the entire lake, but it was the key authority the HOA had used to control the resident. I had targeted Karen's weakest point. The following days were filled with tense negotiations. I met Branson and his two attorneys in a small office downtown. They opened with a much higher number, but I didn't react immediately. I listened, then countered with documentation showing that the lake generated no revenue and only incurred maintenance costs. I argued that holding on to it meant more burden for them, while I was willing to pay in full, P-front. Every negotiation tested me, but I felt more composed each time. Karen had relied on scorn and intimidation. Here, I used reason and patience. I saw them start to waver, and after 4 meetings, we reached an agreement. I signed, received the thick contract in hand. From now on, the power to open or close the fishing season no longer belonged to the HOA. It belonged to me. I returned home, sat alone in the living room, turning through the contract pages as my heart pounded. I imagined the moment Karen stood at the podium, still proud, declaring the fishing season. Then I stepped forward and presented this contract. That image alone was enough to watch her crumble before everyone's eyes. I knew I couldn't reveal it to anyone. Even the people who had met with me in secret only knew that I had a concrete plan. If this information reached Karen, she would surely try to sabotage it or maneuver to take it back. So I kept it as the most guarded secret. I moved as usual, greeted neighbors, showed up at HOA meetings, and even pretended to take notes on the new rules they issued. I wanted Karen to believe I was still cornered, that I had no way to fight back, so she would grow more arrogant by the day. During that time, Karen kept firing off little jabs. Every time I walked by, she had a way of slipping in a dig, like, "Hope you're keeping up with the new rule. We don't need more residents doing whatever they please." I only smiled and said nothing, because I was holding something far stronger than words. She thought she was in control, but I knew she was just a few steps away from walking into a trap. I spent my evenings helping my son with homework, taking him for walks around the lake. He didn't know that the power to decide the fate of that very lake had shifted into my hands. I didn't want to burden him with the tension, but sometimes when I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes each time we passed a group of people in light-colored suits, I told myself, when Karen loses everything, I will let my son witness it with his own eyes, so he knows truth and justice never disappear. They only wait for someone brave enough to claim them. I kept the contract in a safe. Every time I looked at it, I saw clearly how Karen would fall. Every step she took, every word she spoke, now only made her downfall sharper. Late at night, when the streets had gone still, I sat alone thinking about the road ahead. The plan for retribution was nearly complete, only waiting for the right moment. Karen had grown used to seeing submission, but she would soon taste bitter defeat. I knew this strike wasn't just for me. It was for every resident who had once bowed their head in fear. And when that day came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice, wouldn't need to argue. I would only need to present the contract, and the truth would speak for itself, sweeping away her pride. Karen still believed she controlled the lake, but I knew the truth. My quiet move had already flipped the board completely. The big meeting was meticulously prepared by Karen. The hall was decorated with blue posters printed with images of the lake, chairs arranged neatly, and a banner above the podium reading, "Fishing Season Opening." Led by HOA Lakeside, more residents showed up than usual, partly out of curiosity, partly because they felt. Karen arrived right on time, walking confident, her light-colored suit making her stand out like a keynote speaker about to announce something grand. She stepped to the podium, adjusted the microphone, her voice echoing through the room. "This year's fishing season will open in grand fashion under the leadership of the HOA. We will prove that this community still upholds its class and elegance." She finished her sentence. Scattered applause broke out, and someone even whistled. And I sat in the back row, observing every hands clenched face. Karen kept going, listing off events, opening ceremony, and fishing competitions to be managed by the HOA. She spoke as if the lake were her private property, gaze sweeping across the crowd with triumph. People nodded and some glanced at me with pity, as if to say I had lost long ago. When Karen paused to emphasize, "We, and only we, have the right to decide all activities on this lake," I knew it was time. I stood, walked forward, each step slow but deliberate. No one stopped me, because no one knew what I was about to do. I walked straight to the podium and set down a large wooden sign. The bright red letters stunned the room into silence. "Fishing season closed, by order of the owner." The room went dead quiet, and even the creak of someone shifting in their seat rang out clearly. Karen looked at me, eyes wide, voice cracking. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned the microphone toward myself, speaking evenly, each word firm. "The fishing season is no longer under HOA authority. That power has changed hands, and I am the one holding it now." A ripple of whispers spread immediately. Residents murmured, several faces stunned, some covering their mouths in shock. Karen stepped down, trying to snatch the sign away, but I pulled from my pocket a folder and held it high. "This is a legal contract between me and the lake's actual owner. The HOA never held ownership, only a lease. And now, the new agreement places all authority in my hands." The room erupted with chatter. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others clapped with delight. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, hands trembling, with nowhere to rest. I looked her straight in the eyes and stated clearly, "You enjoyed making me a joke, but as of today, the game ends." I turned toward the crowd, eyes meeting theirs. None of us should have to live under fear or be bullied by someone hiding behind the word community. This lake belongs to fairness, not to the control of one autocrat. This time, the applause was thunderous. A few people stood up, and someone even laughed out loud. Karen was still there, stunned, her eyes vacant, lips moving, but no words coming out. In that moment, I knew the retaliation had landed. Karen, once arrogant and commanding, now had to watch the entire community turn on her in a single breath. And I, the one she had humiliated, now held the true authority through a quiet, lawful move. The sign still stood tall on the podium, its blazing red letters like a sentence cast on her pride. And for the first time, the hall held no laughter aimed at me, only eyes full of belief in a change that could no longer be reversed. The entire hall froze. No one had expected to witness this unfold before their eyes. Karen stood like a stone, then suddenly shrieked, her voice breaking in panic. "How dare you! Her scream echoed, bounced off the brick walls, but it no longer carried fear. I calmly opened the folder, lifting pages for all to see. Red seals and clear signatures shone in the light. I looked straight at Karen, letting each word fall with weight. That authority belongs to me, not you. Whispers erupted across the room. Faces that once nodded at her speeches now shifted with disbelief. Someone gave a bitter laugh, and another murmured, so all this time, she never had real control. The eyes that had once avoided mine now stared, curious and almost admiring. Karen staggered a step back, her eyes darting around, searching for a way out. She tried to summon her usual fierceness, but her trembling hands betrayed her. This is fake, can't be real. The HOA has always managed the lake, she stammered, but the words were scattered, stripped of any force. I cut in, firm and clear. The HOA was only leasing it, and that lease is over. This is a new agreement, signed directly with the legal owner. And you should know, the law does not side with liars. My words rang through the now silent room. A few residents nodded, and others clapped in satisfaction. The silence was no longer complicity. It had become witness to a shift in power. Karen scanned the crowd, but instead of support, she met only disappointed stares. A man near the door stood up and called out, "All these years you made us believe the lake belonged to the HOA. Turns out it was all a lie." His words sparked a wave of murmurs, more voices rising to recall how they too had been silent. I stayed where I was, folder in my hand like a verdict. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to insult, because the truth had already crushed every defense she had. I looked at Karen, her eyes now hollow, the fury replaced with fear. I lowered my voice, but let it carry across the entire hall. You turned this lake into a tool for humiliation and control. Today, that tool is no longer yours. The fishing season you promised will never begin, because I do not allow it. Thunderous round of applause erupted. Chairs scraped, people stood. Karen reeled, her lips trembling but unable to form another word. I closed the folder and placed the wooden sign, still bearing the word "Fishing Season Closed" by order of the owner, right at the center of the podium, sealing shut the door on every one of her lies. In that moment, I knew Karen had lost her most powerful weapon, fear of the people. Now, no one wanted to bow to her anymore. The hall buzzed with noise, chatter rippling across the room, but there was one point on which everyone agreed. Karen's false authority had just collapsed on the spot. I stepped back, my eyes still locked on her pale face. Inside me, there was no satisfaction, only finality. This was the inevitable end for someone who had grown used to demeaning others, and I knew this strike was only the beginning of total downfall in front of the entire community. The murmurs spread like wildfire through the room that had just fallen silent. Every whisper, every sigh, even faint scoffs began to rise. A woman in the middle row shot to her, pointing straight at Karen. "So, all this time, she's been lying to us?" That sentence unlocked flood, and a chorus of voice followed. Faces once quiet now flared with anger. Heads nodded in agreement, and all eyes turned, sharp and accusing, toward the woman who used to stand so proudly on the podium. Karen stammered, lip trembling. Her once carefully made-up face had gone pale, her eyes darting wildly, looking for something, anything, to hold on to. The clipboard in her hand slipped and fell to the floor with a hollow thud. She bent down to retrieve it, but her hand shook so badly she couldn't grip it. The crowd buzzed louder, whispers turning into blunt questions. What else has she from us all these years? Is our HOA fee even being used properly? I stood still, saying nothing, letting it all unfold naturally, because the truth had already slipped beyond Karen's control. Every angry stare was another cut, slicing away what was left of her authority. An old man in the back row slowly stood, voice shaky, clear. "I've lived 20 years. I've never seen an HOA president treat residents the way you have. You made us afraid, and we stayed silent because we thought you had power. Turns out it was all a scam." Applause broke out after that, not thunderous, but loud enough to push Karen deeper into panic. She stepped back from the podium, trying to regain her composure. "Don't listen to him," she pleaded. "This is fake. This is slander. I'm the one protecting the values of this community." But her defense was drowned by the rising wave of outrage. A young woman shouted, "Protecting? You find me because my son dropped a candy wrapper on the playground. Is that protection?" That outburst triggered a cascade of others, each voice exposing how Karen had bullied, humiliated, and used residents as tools to feed her control. Karen raised a hand for silence, but no one listened. Chairs scraped across the floor, and people moved closer to the front, eyes blazing. She had been used to silence, to submission. Now, surrounded by those no longer afraid, she looked like someone completely completely out of place. I stepped forward, voice firm. I don't need to prove anything else. You've all seen the truth. The lake never belonged to the HOA, and the authority now lies with me. The only question left is whether this community will keep living under lie. The applause returned, this time louder, spreading then swelling. Karen looked around, her lips moving, but no one stood with her. Former allies sat still, eyes down, some pretending to check their phones, others whispering to avoid her gaze. Karen bent down, grabbed the clipboard, and clutched it to her chest like a final shield. But the sight only made her smaller, more pitiful than powerful. Her pride crumbled right there in front of everyone, and I didn't need to deliver the final blow. She was already undone. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Then chants demanding a vote to remove her began to echo throughout the hall. I stepped back, letting the wave of outrage rise on its own. This was no longer me versus Karen. It was an entire community rising in unison. Karen tried to shout, "I'm still the legitimate HOA president," but her voice was swallowed by a sea of dissenting cries. People stood up, pointed fingers, leveled accusations, and demanded change. The atmosphere in the room turned into a public trial, and she was the defendant. I looked at Karen one last time. Her eyes were vacant, her steps faltered, face pale as though everything had been stripped away, and it had. In that moment, the truth had taken from her what she valued even more than her title, fear she had instilled in others. It was gone, and with it, Karen's little empire dissolved into dust. I stood tall in the center of the hall, my voice cutting through the noise, each word falling like a hammer against the tiled floor. She threatened to ban my boat, so I shut down the entire fishing season she loved flaunt. A few seconds of silence, then the room exploded. Whispers turned into shouting, and residents turned to one another in fury and disbelief. The crowd that had once stayed silent, afraid, now moved as if unchained. People no longer whispered. They spoke loudly, clearly. Karen could hear every word. A woman near the podium snapped, "We've paid fees for years, thinking we earned the right to enjoy the fishing season. Turns out it was just a show she staged." A middle-aged man pushed forward. "We were misled by lies. She's used this lake to punish and threaten us time and again. But that power doesn't belong to the HOA. It belongs to him." He turned toward me, eyes wide with belief and a growing respect. Karen's face went pale, and her fingers clenched the bent clipboard. She stammered, trying to yell over the crowd to regain control. "Don't listen to him. He's just here to destroy our unity. This is slander." But her weak protest was immediately drowned by the chorus of defiance. A young man in the back shouted, "Slander? When did we see the contract with our own eyes? Slander? After all these years of exploitation?" His words struck like a spark to dry grass, igniting the whole room into a frenzy. Residents surged forward, voices rising, hands waving. "We demand a recall vote now," came a cry from one side. "Karen betrayed the trust of this entire community," another voice bellowed. I stayed silent, letting the wave rise. There was nothing more I needed to say. Truth was undeniable, and all I had done was present the evidence. The rest, the voices, the reckoning, belonged to them. Karen kept retreating, her face white as chalk, eyes darting, searching for support, but every one of her former allies had gone quiet, heads down. Not one dared come to her defense. A woman who had once been her right hand turned her back and walked out of the hall without a word. I saw Karen trembling, her voice suddenly soft, almost pleading. "Please, let me explain. Everything I did was to preserve our value, to protect this community." But those words only fueled the outrage further. An elderly man with silver hair, someone I'd often seen quietly walking around the lake, now stood up, leaning on his cane, his voice booming, "Protect us? You punished me just because my grandson ran near the lake. You call that protection? No, that's humiliation. We've stayed silent for far too long." The hall erupted in thunderous applause, not for Karen, but in full agreement with the old man. The sound of clapping slammed into her, making her shoulders tremble uncontrollably. I watched closely, seeing the collapse unfold piece by piece. She was no longer the arrogant woman with a steely voice. Karen was now just a small, trembling shadow before the resistance of the very people she once ruled through fear. Another resident stepped forward and declared firmly, "We need a vote right now. Can't let a liar remain president of the HOA. It's time for a change." Shouts of, "That's right," echoed all around the room. Karen lowered her head, lips moving but no sound coming out. The clipboard slipped from her hands again, and this time she didn't even try to pick it up. It lay there on the floor, abandoned, like a symbol of her downfall beyond repair. I took a deep breath, then turned to the resident. "You've all seen the truth. This isn't just my victory. It's a victory for justice. Every person here deserves to live with dignity, not under the thumb of false authority." Applause rose once more, but this time, it was applause of unity. I looked down the rows of seats and saw faces softening after days of tension, eyes brightening with renewed belief. As for Karen, she slowly backed away toward the the exit, her steps unsteady, leaving behind a wave of outrage she could no longer suppress. In that moment, I knew I had done the right thing. Karen once reveled in turning me into a joke. Now, she was the one made an example of. The residents, those who had endured so much humiliation, had finally reclaimed their voice. Do you think this payback was enough to make Karen truly pay the price? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Karen was ultimately forced to abandon the podium in disgrace. The clipboard, once a symbol of her authority, now clutched like a cold piece of wood in her hand, resembled a headstone marking her failure. She hurried toward the door, each step heavy under the scornful stares of the entire community. No one blocked her path, but the cold gazes were enough to make her walk feel endless. The whispers, the dry chuckle, the hushed comments all followed her out of the room she had once ruled from with a pointed finger. Once the door closed behind her, the atmosphere in the hall shifted entirely. The tension shattered, replaced by lively conversation, relieved sighs, and a swell of applause. People turned to me, some nodding, others patting me on the shoulder, their eyes lit with a trust they hadn't felt in a long time. I knew their joy wasn't just about Karen losing her seat. It was because they had reclaimed their own voices. I stepped forward, my voice calm. The fishing season won't reopen just yet. I want all of us to come together and create new rules. Fairer, clearer, and more transparent. Everyone will have equal rights. No one will use this lake as a tool of control ever again. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause again. This time, resolute and truly unified. I saw Mr. Bennett's face break into a gentle smile. The elderly woman, once forced to uproot her roses, wiped away a tear. The widowed lady held her head a little higher. They understood that my promise wasn't empty. I had proven it through action. In the days that followed, I worked with a group of residents to draft the new regulation. Gone were the days of Karen punishing people for petty, baseless reasons. Every fee was now transparent, and every decision required a fair vote. I saw a shift in my neighbor's eye. What had once been fear and hesitation was now trust. They showed up more often, spoke more freely, and no longer bowed their heads in silence. Even my son sensed the difference. One morning, as I walked him to the dock, he smiled and whispered, "Dad, people say hi to us differently now." I tousled his hair and smiled. A weight lifted from my chest. I knew the shadow of Karen's judgment was gone. Now, the lake was no longer a symbol of oppression. It was a place where he could play freely and learn to face others with confidence. Karen disappeared from the neighborhood not long after. Rumor had it she moved out, taking with her the pride that had already crumbled. No one paid much attention. Everyone had returned to their lives, but with a renewed belief that anyone who tries to dominate through fear will fall when the truth comes to light. Looking back, I realized my act of retaliation wasn't just about settling a personal score. It had awakened courage in the community, helping people see that fairness can be reclaimed when someone is willing to stand up. I saw the power of unity. When one rises, others will follow. That lesson will stay with me, with my son, and with every resident here. The truth cannot stay buried forever. False power cannot last. With patience and determination, justice will always find its way. I looked out over the lake, its surface glistening under the afternoon sun. My small boat was still there, unbanned, no longer a pretext for oppression. I smiled, knowing that from now on, this was no longer just my story, but a testament for the entire community. The arrogant will fall, and justice will ultimately belong to those who never surrender. My son joined me at the dock the morning after the fateful meeting. The sunlight reflected off the water, the ripples gently rising as if the lake itself was sighing in relief. He held my hand, his eyes shining brighter than on the days when he used to keep his head down, avoiding Karen's condescending gaze. Now he held his head high, a wide smile on his face, his voice ringing out clearly. "Dad, you did what everyone was hoping for." I paused, looked at him, and gave a slight nod. His words felt like recognition, not just from a child, but from an entire community. During all the time under pressure, I had often questioned myself, wondered if I had gone too far, but in that moment, seeing the belief in my son's eyes, I knew everything I had done was worth it. I turned to face the lake. A light breeze blew, cool scent of water washing over me. The image of Karen was still vivid in my memory, flustered eyes, pale face as the board slipped from her hand. The moment truth crashed down and fear was stripped bare. The woman who once believed herself untouched, who had turned humiliation into a weapon of control, finally paid the price. What satisfied me wasn't her downfall, but how the community reclaimed its voice. Those who once bowed their heads now stood tall. Those whose voices once trembled now spoke with strength. No one feared the pastel-colored suits anymore. No one believed HOA had absolute power. They all understood that just belongs to those who rise, and Karen was now a lesson. I remembered the evening after Karen left the neighborhood. Some residents came to my house, knocking on the door, bringing firm handshake. Mr. Bennett, the former lawyer, smiled gently and said, "You did what I no longer thought I had the strength to do." The elderly woman, once forced to uproot her rose, brought me a small plant, placed it on my porch, and said, "This time, no one's going to dare pull it up." Those gestures were simple, but they hit me hard. The next day, a new resident board was formed. There was no longer one person barking orders from above. Instead, open meetings welcomed everyone's voice. I participated, but didn't take center stage, because all I wanted was to see things run fairly. When we proposed new lake rules, I made it clear, this lake belongs to all of us. The fishing season, or any activity, will only begin when every resident agrees. The whole room burst into applause. From that day on, my son grew more confident. He no longer avoided neighbors, no longer flinched when someone mentioned the lake. One evening, he sat in the boat with me, watching the water reflect the sunset, and quietly said, "I think no one here will ever forget this." I replied, "What matters isn't that they remember me. They remember the arrogant always pay in the end." I looked out over the lake again, a wave of relief washing over me like never before. I understood that justice doesn't always come swiftly, but when it does, it sweeps away every falsehood. Karen may have once controlled every gaze, spreading fear wherever she walked, but in the end, she was just one person, walking alone under the contemptuous stares of the entire community. This story isn't just about me or a boat that was banned, but about the power of truth. When one person dares to rise, others find the courage to follow. And when a community speaks as one, no tyrant can remain standing. I gently squeezed my son's hand, and the smile on his face strengthened my belief. The lake before us wasn't just a place where father and son found peace, but a living testament. Justice belongs to those who refuse to bow. And I know this lesson would echo in every resident's heart, ensuring no one could ever repeat Karen had done. Looking back on the entire story, I realized that my journey with my son was never just a battle between an ordinary resident and a woman named Karen who happened to be the HOA president. It was a clear demonstration of how fragile false power becomes when confronted by truth and conviction. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary morning, when I took my son to the lake to prepare for a simple rowing trip. That quiet joy was quickly shattered by Karen's threatening tone and the smug posture of those in pale suits following her. From the moment she pointed at my boat and sneered, I knew I had been marked. In the days that followed, I became the constant target of public humiliation. At the community meeting, Karen used me as an example, a name to disgrace before everyone, turning their silence into her weapon. The laugh, the scornful glances, those were the wounds that lingered. And when I heard my son, through tears, ask why we were so hated, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The absurd citation, the threats slipped under my door, made me realize this wasn't personal. It was a matter of... In sleepless nights, I dug through our home purchase documents and found the clue. The lake didn't belong to the HOA. They were only renters. That discovery opened a new path. Mr. Bennett, our elderly neighbor and former lawyer, confirmed that if I obtained the right contract, the balance of power would shift. From there, I combed through every document and detail, eventually discovering that the lease on the lake was about to expire. That was the turning point. I knew I could make the lake a place no one could ever use as a weapon again. While Karen kept hosting meetings to publicly humiliate me, I quietly gathered those she had once oppressed. Stories of uprooted rose bushes, birthday music called uncultured, or a widow mocked for her lack of wealth filled our small meeting room with heavy silence. But when I stood and declared that Karen had crossed final line by threatening my son and me, I saw a spark ignite in their eye. It was the moment fear transformed into resolve. Through persistence, I made direct contact with the company that owned the lake. After multiple rounds of tense negotiations, I held in my hands a new contract, explicitly stating that the right to open or close the fishing season now belonged to me. From that moment, I knew I had secured the decisive move. I kept it secret, allowing Karen to continue parading around, claiming she was the one in control. I wanted her to walk deeper into the trap built from her own arrogance. The most explosive moment came during the big community meeting, when Karen, in front of the entire neighborhood, boldly declared that fishing season would be grandly opened under the leadership of the HOA. I stepped forward and placed the sign, "Fishing season closed," by order of the owner, right in front of her. The room fell completely silent. When she screamed, "You dare!" I held up the signed contract, asserting that the legal authority now rested with. The truth was exposed, and the murmurs rippled out like a storm, unleashing a flood of long-held resentment. Residents stood up one after another, voicing accusation, from petty grievances to questionable fees, turning the meeting hall into an open tribunal. Karen stammered, her face pale, her clipboard falling to the floor. The eyes that once looked to her in submission now stared with anger and contempt. When I declared that she had once threatened to ban my boat, so I had shut down the very fishing season she used to boast about, the crowd erupted. Chants demanding her removal echoed from all directions, sweeping away the last fragments of her authority. In the end, Karen walked out of the hall under a sea of cold, unforgiving stares, carrying with her the total collapse of someone who had ruled through fear. Afterward, the community established a new council with equal participation. I proposed regulations for the lake. All decisions must go through collective approval, with no one allowed to use it as a tool of control. The fishing season was temporarily suspended and replaced by open meetings where everyone could speak freely and transparently. By bit, the residents found their voices again, no longer bowing their heads in silence. My son changed, too. He no longer feared the glances of our neighbors, no longer wondered why our family had been shunned. One morning, he held my hand with a bright smile and said, "Dad, you did what everyone hoped someone would do." That wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had longed just. As I looked out at the lake, I knew the arrogant had finally paid the price they deserved, and justice had returned to those who refused to bow. From this story, I've drawn some hard-earned lessons. First, false power cannot stand when faced truth. Karen had a system. She had the silence of the community, but one legal contract was enough to dismantle it all. Truth will always be the most powerful weapon if someone is brave enough to find it and hold it. Second, silence in the face of injustice only feeds oppression. The day I stood up and announced my intent to fight back, others realized they weren't alone. Unity, once awakened, can shatter fear. Justice does not come from submission, but from standing together in defense of what's right. Third, patience and preparation are the keys to victory. Had I reacted impulsively during the first meeting, I might have only ended up further humiliated. But by waiting, investigating, and securing solid evidence, my counterstrike was not only unexpected, it was undeniable. Sometimes, resistance isn't found in shouting, but in the moment you present the truth at exactly the right time. In the end, I realized that the greatest power doesn't come from personal authority, from responsibility to the community and to the next generation. I chose to act, not just to protect myself and my son, but to help build a fairer environment for everyone. Because a child only truly grows up when they see their father rise to confront injustice. As the story draws to a close, the lake still quietly reflects the sunlight. It was once a symbol of oppression. Now it stands as proof transformation. I believe anyone who hears this story will understand. Injustice may persist, but it cannot endure forever. When one person dares to stand up and face it, the entire community gains the strength to follow. And that is when justice finds its path, not through hollow promises, but through clear, courageous, and deliberate action.